On a cold morning in January 1942, a group of high-ranking Nazi officials gathered at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee. They were not there to discuss military strategy or the front lines of the war that was consuming Europe. Instead, they met to coordinate the logistical details of what they euphemistically called the final solution to the Jewish question. The atmosphere inside the elegant dining room was calm and bureaucratic as 15 men sat around a large table. Reinhard Heydrich chaired the meeting and outlined the plan for the systematic deportation and extermination of the Jewish population across German-occupied Europe. This meeting marked a pivotal shift from random violence to industrialized murder. The villa at Wannsee stood in stark contrast to the horrific agenda on the table. Outside, the snow-covered grounds were peaceful, while inside the machinery of genocide was being oiled with ink and paper. The secretaries took notes as the men discussed the capacity of trains and the efficiency of various killing methods. There was no debate about the morality of mass murder, only discussion regarding the most efficient means to achieve it. This bureaucratic detachment remains one of the most chilling aspects of the Holocaust. It demonstrated how a modern state could utilize its entire administrative infrastructure to target a specific group of its own citizens for total annihilation. To understand how such a meeting was possible, one must look back at the years preceding the war. Anti-Semitism was not a new invention of the Nazi Party, but had deep roots in European history. However, Adolf Hitler and his followers weaponized this ancient prejudice with modern propaganda and pseudo-scientific racism. Upon rising to power in 1933, the Nazi regime began a gradual process of social exclusion. They did not start with gas chambers, but with words and laws that separated neighbors from neighbors. The first steps involved boycotts of Jewish businesses and the removal of Jewish civil servants from their posts, creating a divide in German society. The legal framework for persecution was solidified in 1935 with the passage of the Nuremberg Laws. These laws stripped German Jews of their citizenship and prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and citizens of German or kindred blood. The laws defined Jewishness not by religious practice, but by ancestry, making it impossible for individuals to escape persecution through conversion. Overnight, people who had considered themselves loyal Germans found themselves classified as subjects of the state with fewer rights than foreigners. This legislation provided the legal cover for the escalating harassment and violence that would follow in the years to come. The situation deteriorated rapidly in 1938 during the event known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. On the night of November 9th, Nazi stormtroopers and civilians rampaged through Jewish neighborhoods across Germany and Austria. They shattered the windows of Jewish-owned stores, looted homes, and burned over 1,000 synagogues. The streets were covered in broken glass, and the air was thick with smoke and fear. Firefighters stood by and watched, receiving orders only to prevent the flames from spreading to nearby non-Jewish properties. This state-sponsored pogrom signaled that Jewish life and property were no longer under the protection of the law. In the aftermath of Kristallnacht, the Nazi regime arrested 30,000 Jewish men and sent them to concentration camps like Dachau and Buchenwald. This was the first time that Jews were imprisoned on a mass scale simply for who they were. The goal at this stage was still forced emigration, as the regime sought to pressure Jews to leave the country by making life unbearable. Families scrambled to obtain visas to foreign nations, but they found many doors closed. The international community expressed outrage, but offered little concrete assistance, leaving thousands trapped within the tightening grip of the Third Reich. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked the beginning of World War II and a drastic escalation in Nazi racial policy. With the conquest of Western Poland, millions more Jews came under German control. The Nazi leadership decided to concentrate this population into designated urban districts known as ghettos. In cities like Warsaw and Lodz, Jews were forced to leave their homes and move into cramped, dilapidated areas, sealed off from the rest of the city by walls and barbed wire. These ghettos were designed to be holding pens where overcrowding and lack of resources would lead to a slow death. Life inside the Warsaw Ghetto was a daily struggle for survival against impossible odds. Over 400,000 people were packed into an area of just over 1 square mile. Food rations were deliberately set at starvation levels, forcing families to smuggle goods in through tunnels or over walls just to survive. Disease ran rampant in the unsanitary conditions, with typhus claiming thousands of lives each month. Despite the misery, the inhabitants tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. They organized secret schools, operated underground presses, and held religious services in basements, refusing to let their spirits be crushed completely. While the ghettos concentrated the Jewish population in the cities, a different tragedy was unfolding in the east. Following the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the army. These squads were tasked with rounding up Jewish men, women, and children in conquered territories. They drove their victims to ravines or forests, forced them to dig their own graves, and shot them point blank. Babi Yar near Kiev became a symbol of these massacres, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days. This marked the phase of the Holocaust known as the Holocaust by bullets. The psychological toll on the executioners and the inefficiency of shooting millions of people led the Nazi leadership to seek a new method of killing. They wanted a system that was faster, cheaper, and less stressful for their soldiers. Experiments began with gas vans, which pumped carbon monoxide into sealed cargo compartments. This method was first used at the Chelmno extermination camp in late 1941. It was a crude precursor to the stationary gas chambers that would soon be built. The shift from public shootings to enclosed gassing facilities marked the transition to the industrialized phase of the genocide. Operation Reinhard was the code name for the secretive German plan to exterminate Polish Jewry. To implement this, 3 purpose-built death camps were constructed at Belzec-Sobibor and Treblinka. Unlike concentration camps, which also functioned as labor centers, these facilities existed for one primary purpose, which was mass murder. They were small, efficient factories of death located in remote areas near railway lines. Trains arrived daily, delivering thousands of victims who were marched directly from the cattle cars to the gas chambers. Very few people who entered these camps survived for more than a few hours. The largest and most infamous of the camps was Auschwitz-Birkenau, located in occupied Poland. It was a vast complex that combined a concentration camp, a labor camp, and an extermination center. The entrance gate bore the deceptive slogan Arbeit macht frei, meaning work sets you free. This lie greeted the weary prisoners who arrived after days of travel in suffocating cattle cars. Upon arrival, they underwent a process known as the selection. SS doctors stood on the ramp and with a flick of a hand decided who would live to work and who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers. The transport trains were the arteries of the Holocaust, pumping victims from all over Europe into the death camps. Jews were rounded up from France, the Netherlands, Hungary, and Greece and packed into freight cars without food, water, or sanitation. The journey could last for days, and many people, especially the elderly and young children, died before reaching their destination. Inside the cars, the heat was unbearable in summer and the cold freezing in winter. The utter lack of dignity during transport was the first stage of a process designed to strip the victims of their humanity. Those who survived the initial selection at Auschwitz were subjected to a brutal dehumanization process. Their hair was shaved off and their personal belongings were taken away. They were issued striped uniforms and a number was tattooed on their forearm, replacing their name. This tattoo became a permanent mark of their status as property of the SS. Prisoners were assigned to barracks where they slept on wooden bunks, often 3 or 4 to a single level. The loss of individual identity was a calculated psychological tactic to break the will of the prisoners and make them easier to control. Daily life in the camps was a cycle of hunger, terror, and exhaustion. Prisoners were woken before dawn for roll call, where they had to stand at attention for hours regardless of the weather. They were then marched off to perform slave labor in factories, construction sites, or mines. The work was backbreaking and the rations consisted of watery soup and a small piece of bread. This policy of extermination through labor was designed to work prisoners to death. Those who became too weak or sick to work were selected for the gas chambers during routine inspections. The medical block at Auschwitz was a place of particular horror, presided over by doctors like Joseph Mengele. He conducted cruel and pseudo-scientific experiments on prisoners with a particular interest in twins and people with physical abnormalities. These experiments were performed without anesthesia and often resulted in death or permanent disfigurement. The doctors who had sworn an oath to heal used their skills to torture and kill. This perversion of medicine highlighted the total moral collapse of the Nazi ideology, where human beings were treated as mere biological material. Despite the overwhelming power of the Nazi machinery, there were acts of resistance both large and small. In the Warsaw Ghetto, the surviving Jews realized that deportation meant death and decided to fight back. In April 1943, a group of young fighters led by Mordechai Anielewicz launched an armed uprising. With few weapons and homemade Molotov cocktails, they held off the German army for nearly a month. The ghetto was eventually burned to the ground, but the uprising became a symbol of Jewish courage and defiance, proving that they would not go to their deaths quietly. Resistance also occurred inside the extermination camps themselves. In August 1943, prisoners at Treblinka seized weapons from the armory and set fire to the camp buildings. Hundreds attempted to escape into the surrounding forests, though many were hunted down and killed. A similar revolt took place at Sobibor in October 1943, leading to the closure of the camp. These uprisings were acts of desperate bravery by people who knew they had almost no chance of survival. They fought not necessarily to save their lives, but to save their human dignity. As the war turned against Germany in 1944, the pace of the killing accelerated. The Nazi leadership rushed to deport the Jewish population of Hungary, the last large community remaining in Europe. In just 8 weeks, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz. The crematoria could not keep up with the number of bodies, and open burning pits were used. At the same time, the Allies were advancing from both the east and the west. The Nazis began to destroy evidence of their crimes, dismantling gas chambers and burning documents. With the Soviet army approaching from the east, the SS began evacuating the camps in late 1944 and early 1945. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced on what became known as death marches. They were made to walk for weeks in freezing winter conditions with little or no food. Those who could not keep up were shot by the guards and left on the side of the road. The roads of Poland and Germany were lined with the corpses of those who had survived the camps only to perish in the final months of the war. The liberation of the camps began as Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory. Soviet soldiers were the first to encounter a major camp when they liberated Majdanek in July 1944. They found gas chambers still standing in warehouses filled with thousands of pairs of shoes. The world was initially skeptical of the Soviet reports, but the evidence was undeniable. In January 1945, the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, finding 7,000 emaciated survivors and piles of unburied bodies. The soldiers were shocked by the scale of the atrocity they uncovered. In the West American and British troops liberated camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen in the spring of 1945. At Bergen-Belsen, British soldiers found thousands of unburied bodies and prisoners dying of typhus and starvation. The conditions were so horrific that they had to use bulldozers to bury the dead in mass graves to prevent the spread of disease. Battle-hardened soldiers broke down in tears at the sights they witnessed. The images captured by military photographers during the liberation would soon be broadcast to the world. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, visited the Oadruf subcamp of Buchenwald shortly after its liberation. He ordered that every American soldier in the area not on the front lines visit the camp to see what they were fighting against. Eisenhower also insisted that journalists and politicians come to witness the evidence. He famously predicted that the day might come when some would deny these crimes had ever happened, and he wanted to ensure there was ample documentation. His foresight proved crucial in establishing the historical record. The end of the war brought the reckoning of the Nuremberg trials beginning in November 1945. High-ranking Nazi officials, including Hermann Göring, were put on trial for crimes against humanity. The prosecutors used the Nazis' own meticulous records to prove the systematic nature of the genocide. For the first time in history, leaders were held legally accountable for their actions against civilians. The trials established important legal precedents and exposed the full extent of the Holocaust to the German public and the world. For the survivors, the end of the war was not the end of their suffering. Many returned to their hometowns only to find their houses occupied and their families gone. Anti-Semitism persisted in parts of Europe, leading to violence even after the Nazi defeat. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors ended up in displaced persons camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy. They lived in limbo, often for years, waiting for permission to emigrate to Palestine or the United States. It was a period of intense trauma as they tried to rebuild their lives from nothing. The vast majority of Europe's Jewish children had been murdered, creating a lost generation. Those who survived had often been hidden in convents, orphanages, or by Christian families. Reclaiming their identity was a painful and complex process. Many had forgotten their parents or their religion, and some never learned of their true origins. Organizations worked tirelessly to reunite families, but for most, there was no one left to find. The cultural and intellectual future of European Jewry had been all but wiped out. The scale of the loss was staggering, with 6 million Jews murdered, representing 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe. But the Holocaust also claimed millions of other victims, including Romani people, people with disabilities, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents. The Nazis also targeted homosexuals and Jehovah's Witnesses. Each group was marked with a different colored triangle in the camps, but all suffered under the same brutal system. The universality of the suffering serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred. One of the few lights in this darkness was the phenomenon of the righteous among the nations. These were non-Jewish individuals who risked their lives to save Jews from the Nazis. People like Oskar Schindler, who used his factory to protect workers, and Raoul Wallenberg, who issued protective passports in Budapest. There were also countless ordinary people who hid families in their attics or cellars. Their actions proved that even in the midst of terror, individuals still had the moral choice to act with humanity. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 was deeply connected to the aftermath of the Holocaust. The genocide convinced many that the Jewish people could only be safe in their own sovereign state. The influx of survivors into the new nation shaped its culture and identity. The phrase "never again" became a central tenet of Israeli society and Jewish communities worldwide. It was a vow that the Jewish people would never again allow themselves to be defenseless victims of such a slaughter. In the decades following the war, the world struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the Holocaust. The word genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin specifically to describe these crimes. International laws were rewritten to define and punish the crime of genocide. The United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 partially in response to the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. The Holocaust fundamentally changed how the world understood human rights and the responsibilities of nations. Today, the physical evidence of the Holocaust remains in the form of memorials and museums. The camps at Auschwitz and Dachau have been preserved as sites of remembrance and education. Visitors walk through the same gates and see the same barracks that once housed the condemned. These sites serve as powerful warnings about the fragility of democracy and the consequences of prejudice. They ask every visitor to bear witness to the past and to reflect on their own moral responsibilities in the present. The testimony of survivors has been crucial in keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive. For decades, men and women shared their painful stories in schools and documentaries, ensuring that the truth would not die with them. As the generation of survivors passes away, the responsibility of remembrance shifts to future generations. Recorded testimonies and written memoirs like those of Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi have become essential historical documents. They provide the personal human voice that statistics alone cannot convey. Holocaust denial and distortion remain persistent challenges in the modern world. Despite the overwhelming evidence, some individuals and groups seek to minimize or deny the reality of the genocide. This denial is often driven by the same anti-Semitic ideologies that fueled the Holocaust itself. Combating these falsehoods requires a commitment to historical truth and education. It is a constant battle to ensure that the facts of history are not rewritten or forgotten by those with a hateful agenda. The legacy of the Holocaust extends beyond the Jewish community and touches all of humanity. It forces us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature and the capacity for evil that exists within civilized societies. It challenges us to recognize the early warning signs of hatred and to speak out against injustice before it is too late. The study of the Holocaust is not just a history lesson, but a lesson in civic responsibility and moral courage. As we look back at the systematic extermination of Jews in Nazi Germany, we are left with a haunting silence. It is the silence of the 6 million voices that were extinguished and the generations that were never born. We honor them not only by remembering their deaths, but by celebrating the resilience of the human spirit that survived. We must carry their memory forward as a torch against the darkness, ensuring that the promise of never again is not just a slogan, but a solemn eternal vow.